From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, human consciousness. Here's what's happening. 3 people dead, at least 15 injured after a fiery crash involving a bus carrying band students in Ohio. The deadly incident took place on Interstate 70, about 26 miles east of Columbus. A semi-truck rammed into the rear of the bus. There were 57 people traveling on that bus. Russia has lost a staggering 302,000 soldiers killed and wounded in Ukraine, and tens of thousands more have deserted, according to new UK figures. The stats do not include countless more who were mowed down fighting for pro-Putin organizations like the Wagner Group. U.S. officials are finalizing an agreement with China to crack down on the export of the source of chemicals used to make fentanyl, according to 2 people familiar with the matter. The deal, which has been a priority for the Biden administration, is expected to be finalized and announced with President Joe Biden's summit meeting in San Francisco Bay with the Chinese President Xi. Let's check in with online columnist Dr. John Curtis. John, I hope this has some teeth. What do you think?
Well, I mean, this is an election year PR stunt by Biden. I mean, this relationship that he's created with China is the worst in U.S. history of any president. And, you know, we're talking about major issues going on here. The end of arms control, George, as we know it. We have Biden violating the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act that was signed into law by Jimmy Carter that basically said the U.S. no longer supports militarily Taiwan. They ended the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan. You've got the U.S. shooting down a spy satellite just a few months ago in February, and you've got many other issues, including the U.S. Biden administration trying to create a NATO-like entity in China's backyard with Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other, Indonesia, Malaysia, other nations that are, and Australia, of course, that are designed to thwart the Chinese in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. So when you're talking about signing a letter agreeing that we need to reduce the supply of chemicals that is involved in fentanyl, I mean, this is completely inconsequential. As important as it is that there's less people dying of these, addictions, the real issue is the Ukraine war. I mean, Xi and Biden disagree over what caused the war. Xi has said publicly that the war was caused because Biden was arming Ukraine and refused to talk to Putin about new security arrangements over there. So there's a lot at stake, but this is an election year publicity stunt to make Biden look like he's in control of foreign policy when everyone knows that the White House foreign policy is totally out of control right now.
How do you think this summit meeting's going to go?
I think it's going to basically be kiss, and Xi is interested in meeting with big U.S. donors and keeping the money rolling into China. He's not really that interested in meeting with Biden, but I think it as far as the window dressing over in San Francisco, cleaning the sludge off the streets, the drug addicts and the homeless people are there. They've all gotten rid of them, the liberal city of San Francisco, because they don't want Xi looking at it on his motorcade from the San Francisco airport into the city. So, I think it's going to go okay, but bear in mind that it's fake and it's an election year publicity stunt for Biden.
Dr. John Curtis, onlinecolumnist.com. First, the bad news. Prices continue to rise. Now the good news. They're doing it at a rate not seen in 2 years. The Consumer Price Index rose 3.2% for the 12 months that ended in October, down from 3.7% in September and clocking in the lowest annual rate since March of 2021. That's good news. Let's check in with our expert, Charles Koppes, to get his thoughts on this. Charles, stock market was happy today. Things seem okay. What do you think?
Well, they sure seem that way. And, it's down a little bit from September, but we're still higher than the Fed target rate they have, and up 2%. And, this figure was slightly lower than expected, as we know, and largely due to a drop in gasoline prices and rents and healthcare costs were mentioned. But one report says the BLS is calculating healthcare costs about 30% lower than the actual data since 2020. I don't know, but regardless, we know the CPI is up about 18% in 3 years, and this is really being reflected in the food prices, which is not part of the core inflation. And it also wipes out any wage increases in the labor market, which has really been suffering that. Household debt right now is about $17 trillion. I think that's a new record. In a poll, I saw 80% said they're worse off under Biden or Bidenomics. And, so far this year we've seen about 312 working strikes involving 400,000 employees. This is about a tenfold increase from a couple of years ago. You can see the mood right now, and we'll see if Christmas makes that a little better. But meanwhile, we do have stocks up, a prospect that the Fed is going to cut rates next year. And some of the headlines were just, stocks are soaring, it was up like 1%, 1.5. But, the stock market's already in a bubble. It's a bad metric for the economy. The market cap is about 167,000. Normal is about 75%. Market cap to GDP. So it's what they call a Buffett indicator. And that's probably why Warren Buffett is sitting on, $250 billion in cash to pick up the bargains later on. And just today we saw the 50-day moving average on stocks go below the 200-day average, what they call this a death cross. And this has preceded every bear market in the past 100 years, so, investors should be aware. But right now, I think the big question is, will they cut rates after 12 rate hikes? And this is probably pretty likely in 2024. That's what they're pricing in right now. That's 6 months away or something. But, we simply can't have a 5 or 7% interest rate, with our national debt, which is, $33 trillion. I mean, this isn't 1980. This is higher than the combined GDPs of China and Japan and Germany and India. And now the interest rate just exceeded $1 trillion a year. Now, this was only $480 billion a couple of years ago, George. I mean, this is unsustainable. Just think of that.
Huge.
I look at that as a taxpayer, And, inflation's an increase in the money supply, as we see in the M2 money index at the banking levels. But now you have even Fitch downgrading our bond markets recently. Moody is ready or saying they will do the same. And this brings into question our uncreditworthiness. This is what you get with a central bank, So the Fed's going to have a problem, I think, next year in March. And this is when the bank funding program ends. And the banks right now, we know, are having major liquidity crisis with negative yielding portfolios. And many analysts are looking at a commercial real estate collapse. The commercial real estate sector, that's about $2-3 trillion. And, you know what they say, if you owe the bank $1,000, you have a problem. But if you owe the bank $1 million or $1 billion, the bank has a problem. And I think that's what we're going to see in 2024.
All right, Charles. Thanks. Appreciate it. Charles' book, America's Financial Reckoning Day. Now, the vast majority of dog and cat owners will say their pets enrich their lives in countless ways and bring immeasurable levels of extra happiness. I would agree with that. But researchers from Michigan State University suggest that most pet owners may just be telling themselves what they want to hear. Their new study finds that despite owners claiming pets improve their lives, researchers did not see a reliable association between pet ownership and well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's interesting statistics. In a moment, he's back. Bart Kosko with us, Fuzzy Thinking, and how AI thinks in shades of gray. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Dr. Bart Kosko back with us, professor of electrical and computer engineering and law at USC, an award-winning researcher in artificial intelligence. As a matter of fact, he just won the prestigious Hebb Award for Neural Learning from the International Neural Network Society. He holds several patents as the author of numerous scientific studies in AI as well as textbooks. He has just re-released his 1993 book, Fuzzy Thinking, How AI Thinks in Shades of Gray. Bart, welcome back. How have you been?
Good. How have you been, George?
All good, all good. Artificial intelligence continues to be on everybody's mind these days. Why?
Yes, it will be for quite some time. We're really in just the very early age of AI. The principles of AI, like in the original edition of my book, Fuzzy Thinking, 30 years ago, they haven't changed a lot. What has changed is the power of computers, like the smartphone I'm holding in my hand that has a chip in it, the A15, that has 15 billion on-off circuits, something that was just unheard of a few decades ago. And a lot of the good things and a lot of the bad things, George, about AI have to do with this exponential speed up in the computation of what we call AI, and not a corresponding exponential improvement in our understanding of the principles.
Do you think it's justified to be concerned about AI, Bart?
It's mandatory. Again, we're in the very early phases. So think about what it was like when the Model T rolled off the assembly line over a century ago. It was exciting. It was commercially available. Think about the accidents. It changed tort law, for example, and it was a far cry from the car you likely drove in the last couple of days.
You have called something called hallucinations with AI. What is that?
AI systems, as we now know them, especially, but not only, the large language models like the ChatGPT models, which I believe were released prematurely. They're very helpful. They will give you false answers with complete confidence of an expert, a hallucination. It's a form of lying, actually. And it results, George, from the very nature of an AI or neural network system, the thing that makes it relatively easy to train. We just take one pattern and stick it on top of another, almost carelessly so. Just the more stuff you can throw at the neural network to learn from, the more it superimposes the patterns. And it does generalize from that, but it also gets a little too creative. So hallucinations are a form of creativity. I think you can use them for good and bad. I'm actually teaching and giving a lecture on this tomorrow in my AI class at USC. But when you ask the system a question, as you might have seen on 60 Minutes back in April in the re-release of the program in July, and the team asked Microsoft's Bard system about inflation, and they got a very smart answer that cited 5 economics textbooks. But when they got home and looked it up, there were no such 5 textbooks. It literally made up to 5 textbooks. And some lawyers have relied, for example, on chat-type systems that have been hallucinating cases. And unfortunately for the lawyers, they relied on the cases without checking. Now, there's nothing wrong with suggesting cases. That's a very good form of creativity. But to rely on them, well, the lawyers have gotten sanctioned. So you've got to be careful with these systems, and they drift. They don't just hallucinate, make things up, and in effect lie to you with a straight face, George. They also give you different answers to the same questions. And if you've ever interrogated something like ChatGPT-5 or 4 of the related systems, you might have noticed that. And apparently what's going on is when it gets some negative responses from you, for example, you might say, that's just not true, and it goes back. It uses a form of what's called reinforcement learning, and it turns a lot of the knobs, a lot of the wires, a lot of the synaptic knobs, like the wires that connect neurons in a brain, rather indiscriminately, which is the nature of the algorithm, these old algorithms. And as a consequence, we've seen questions about something as simple, is this integer a prime number? Like 7 is prime, but 6 is not. And you got very good answers back in March. You got much worse answers to the same question, some studies have found, over the summer. So you got to be careful with these things. They do hallucinate. The AI systems are racing ahead, adding ever more parameters, taking on ever more data at the input. There's kind of a horse race that's taken off, almost a race to the bottom between some of the big tech companies, George, in the sense of they're hallucinating more. They really have not addressed that. They're trying to, but they have not addressed that, and they keep adding more knobs to turn or parameters. They're up to 500 billion now in some of these models,
Jeez.
And they'll clearly be up to 1 trillion. It takes giant buildings, in effect, of supercomputers to train these things. So they're not like the smartphone that you're holding or other simpler types of devices. So we just don't know where we're going with that exactly when we get an answer from an AI system, how confident we are in it. We're working on it, but you've got to be extremely careful. One more time, we're at the very beginning of artificial intelligence.
Bart, what do you think is the worst that could go wrong with AI?
Well, besides the over-reliance and the crashing of our systems, I think the biggest problem remains bad human actors, especially state actors. And you could see that we're entering an era. I mean, since I last talked to you, George, we're de facto involved in 2 wars. one in Europe and one in the Middle East.
Yep.
There's a lot of players there, all of whom have access to inexpensive, off-the-shelf devices, can do a lot of malice with that. And that, I think, to the first extent is the problem. A lot of spoofing type things. Like, for example, our GPS system that we've come to rely on is not backed up. And it wouldn't cost that much to back it up. There's an attempt to sort of back it up. The Russians have roughly copied part of our system, as have the Chinese. Their systems are backed up. But there's different ways to spoof that system. And it wouldn't take a lot. As far as we know, there may already been some penetration of the GPS software system and of our power grid and so many other things. So that, I think, is your big concern. I don't think it's the Terminator 1 or 2 Skynet waking up and taking things over. I think it's just bad actors, especially if there's a hostile conflict.
You don't think it would get to a point where it will shut down a nuke launch on its own or launch on its own?
If that happened, it might be hard to prove that it wasn't autonomous, but I bet it was a bad actor behind it. I doubt it. On the other hand, pure dumb luck. Look, a lot of the nuclear software that's out there, in the sense of the software that controls our missiles and others, was written in very old languages. And
is it hackable?
Outdated, like Fortran and COBOL and things like that. And who's around really to update that stuff? And the circuitry has to be modified. So there's a lot of room for mistakes. And in engineering, you can get cascades of mistakes, and that's what I'd worry about in that regard. I don't think, again, an autonomous sense of waking up as if the creature had an endocrine system. Of course, you could program it that way. I think it's much more likely dumb luck, parts failures on a massive scale, and especially hostile actors.
Now, you said something interesting, too. You can program it that way. Is AI a process of the programmer, or does it go off on its own?
It goes off on the data's own. It's a little different here. So if we're programming a traditional algorithm, and we are, and those are important, you can certainly make those mischievous or just make a dumb mistake. And if you've ever looked at someone else's code, I know a lot of people listening have done that, you'll understand why people get paid a lot, not just to write code, George, but to correct people's old code, trying to figure out what was this guy saying or this gal saying, that sort of thing. But when you train on data, on ever larger sets of images or words spoken or all kinds of things that have recently led to a lot of copyright litigation, when you do that, you don't really know what you've got in there. You're training off that. It's hallucinating off that. You're teaching it through the neural algorithms to generalize, but you really don't know what it's generalizing to. You don't even really know what you've got already put into it. So it's not like you had a particular register in the computer where you put somebody's face and then I put your face here and my face there. It's not like that. All the faces get superimposed one on top of the other. That has very complicated, unforeseen, nonlinear effects, like holograms in effect, stacked one atop another.
Update us on this federal class action lawsuits that are out there against big tech companies.
There's a bunch of them. The main one started just with, hey, you can't use my image without my permission. And then, hey, you can't train your large language model like the chat systems on my books. And so there's class action lawsuit. The actress, comedian Sarah Silverman, for example, is one of the representatives of one class action. So that's ongoing. There have been some recent responses from the big tech firms, in effect saying, which is not a legal issue, hey, AI's path-breaking, very important. And then they kind of get down to rebutting the claims, but we'll see. This is pretty clearly headed to the Supreme Court. They want to argue, the big tech companies, that it's what's called fair use, that it's okay to use this because, in effect, brains use it. You and I have trained off other people's faces and voices, and from what we've read. The trouble with that argument is the law doesn't recognize that yet, and they're likely using it for commercial purposes. Then there's been problems about privacy. All kinds of problems have arrived. And so some new litigation has been federal class actions on privacy. Federal because it's involving multiple states here as well, and unfair competition, things like that, in a recent lawsuit in particular against Meta and likely to others about related addiction properties of this. So an awful lot. What's happening is the regulation that is sure to come of big tech is likely to come after this litigation works its way out in the next 2 or 3 years.
When you re-released Fuzzy Thinking, did you have to update it at all?
I did somewhat, and I also had to link it directly to a lot of technical updates are available for free on my webpage. But the crucial ideas, like, for example, learning rules and patterns from data and being able to explain the system, That was in the original edition, and I tried to illustrate that with some figures. But, again, it was 1993, and the book's really written in 92, and we just didn't have the image. I mean, those days, it originally came out from Disney, from Hyperion. They even hand-typed in the text. They wouldn't even use my Word files in those days.
Jeez.
So there's been a lot of that kind of a thing of updating. But, again, the principles, no, not at all. They've barely changed.
Hold on, Bart. We'll be back in a moment as we continue chatting with you about artificial intelligence. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Dr. Bart Kosko. We'll take calls with Bart next hour here on Coast to Coast. Bart, what kind of questions do your students ask about AI?
Well, many times. First, of how do we get a job in it, of course, which is partly why they're there.
Yeah.
But the real question, the question everybody has, is how does it work? What's the trick? It looks like a magic act where you're pulling the rabbit out of the hat. That's still a working metaphor of a magician. How does it work? What's the secret to it? And the answers haven't been real good over the years. One of the reasons I've been able to contribute to the field, not just since when I started way back almost 4 decades ago in the 80s. You mentioned I won the HEB Award for neural learning. A lot of it's for material developed back then for how real brains work. But I've been teaching probability and statistics essentially nonstop since then. And I was able to see that a lot of the algorithms currently being used really reduced to trying to find the most probable outcome. Now, people were aware of that by, in effect, walking up to the nearest hill of probability. So I know it seems a little demystifying, but the question, is that true? And it turns out there's kind of a two-step walk. It's known as the EM algorithm. And after working on the EM algorithm, finding a way to improve it with noise, getting a patent on it, one day it hit me. I felt like in the movie 2001, George, the man who's dropping the bone and it finally dawns on him it's a weapon. I mean, how many years have I been staring at this to realize, hey, wait a minute, the main algorithm here, it's called backpropagation for learning, is just a form of climbing that two-step way up the nearest hill of probability, and we have a patented formula, so to speak, for improving that. Quickly filed more patents and recently just got another one in it. So that over the years, just by teaching, rethinking what's being done, going back to the old algorithms from 30, 40, some cases 50 years ago, I and others able to take a more probabilistic interpretation. And that's still current because most people, the overwhelming majority of people who work in this field, my professional opinion, don't know what they're doing other than running software that someone else wrote. And I assume the people who wrote the software knew what they're doing. But the majority of people I see getting hired and working on this, very intelligent people, very well-intended people, they're still running software someone else wrote. And just think about that for a minute. And that software is changing all the time on computers that are more powerful without a deep understanding. So that to answer your question, it's their question, how does this thing work? Why does it work? And how does it screw up? What can we do to fix it? But until you have a good sense of why it works, which takes us all the way back to the brain, you're still kind of flying on a form of groupthink, in my opinion. One more thing, if you look at what's being done and what's called AI today, as I said, it takes supercomputers that would fill large buildings, constantly training. And I say to my class, compare that to a sparrow. And we say, hey, you've got a bird brain as an insult. Well, not in my class. A bird brain is a very wonderful thing. We can't come close with our best guidance systems in F-16 to what a sparrow can do. And its bird brain is the size of your thumbnail. Now, you think about that. Your brain's 3 pounds. It's just a tiny fraction of that. Look at what a sparrow can do. Put a little food out sometime and feed them. And not just a sparrow, George. Take another look at a fly. Now, a fly has in its brain not that many neurons. It has maybe 100,000, these little on-off switches. A cockroach, which is much smarter, has about 1 million neurons. And so my colleagues have rethought cockroaches and been coming up with sets of them or swarms of them that could be used potentially after there's been a severe earthquake. And the cockroaches or the artificial cockroaches as a group kind of smell the blood or smell the humans can go down and locate people. So we're rethinking cockroaches. We're rethinking the entire animal kingdom. But the point is those kinds of brains, the brains that nature has fashioned, not the ones that big tech has fashioned, are based on a very different approach called feedback, where one thing loops to another. For example, every cell in your brain. You've got about 100 billion of them, as opposed to, say, an owl, which has about 1 billion. Every one of those 100 billion neurons, George, connects to about 10,000 other neurons, and massively fed back. Again, it's 3 pounds of boneless tissue, and look what it can do. Totally different than the organizing principle of the large language models and the visual system, as important as they are. But those, in effect, just run like water through a garden hose and spit out the other end. They just run from left to right. We call it feed forward, and they have to get ever bigger and bigger and bigger. So a lot of us realize that's not sustainable. The underlying growth in computer chips is not sustainable. We're already switching from purely electrical to electro-optical. We're going to have to keep doing things like that to keep up the rate of growth. But it's the organizational principles that are changing, and that's where the excitement is at the teaching level, at the PhD level.
Do you think when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak came up with their Apple computer, they would have anticipated what we're talking about tonight?
A little bit if they would have, simply because of the sci-fi movies. And the great one, of course, I mentioned earlier, is 2001: A Space Odyssey.
With Hal the computer, right?
Hal the computer and Arthur C. Clarke, whom I knew, and I mentioned before I dedicated my novel Cool Earth to him. We discussed that. They were really thinking hard about what was going on. They had as their main consultant my good friend Marvin Minsky. He's gone now. He used to be at MIT. And by the way, Marvin has a paper he wrote in 1961 about what's current in artificial intelligence. I always start my class by giving that to students because it's absolutely relevant today. Again, the main thing that's changed is the computing power. So they had some sense, but on the other hand, in terms of what you're talking about, I think the computing power that, again, I could speak to you on a relatively inexpensive device that has the A15 chip that has 15 billion on-off switches in it. I don't think they could foresee that. Or the way that we link up in real time. If you think about all the links between wherever you're sitting, where I'm sitting, where the audience is sitting, the bit packets passing back and forth, it is a type of new digital brain. I think that was outside everyone's foresight. And you can tell when you go back and watch the old science fiction movies, there's nothing like this in them.
And it's just going to get faster and better and faster and better, isn't it?
Absolutely, for quite a time. So right now the trick is how do we keep up this Moore's Law where the number of circuits, on-off switches, doubles every 2 years? That's been going on since I was born in 1960. And in the year after that, 61, the first chip was for sale. It had only 4 switches on it, like 4 valves. Think about that. And now we're up to 15 billion.
Oh,
and the trouble, we're getting so tiny. Yeah, we have to take light and burn into silicon and other substrates like that. We have to burn in patterns, and there's ways to trick it. The Zeiss company that was famously used to help out the film director Stanley Kubrick in his movie Barry Lyndon, beautiful, underrated movie. He was able to shoot by natural light because he got Zeiss to polish their lenses. Well, Zeiss is working with ASML, the Dutch company, the only company in the world, George, that makes these extreme ultraviolet lithography devices that can work that light and can create the kind of chips that you and I are using right now, largely done at TSMC in Taiwan, and they're starting to move that now to Arizona. But that sort of thing will continue, and what we're doing now is switching from electrons to photons, from electricity to light, and that you'll see a lot more of that coming. We have a big breakthrough that just took place called the quantum dot. It led to Nobel Prizes, and rightly so, last month to some chemists. A quantum dot is a type of artificial atom. You will soon see it in your screens. I just saw a patent from Samsung, the Korean giant, that got a patent within 1 year. Let me tell you, in the patent world, George, it's very, very rare. It often takes several years to get a decision from the patent office. And this was for cadmium-free quantum dots. Now, these artificial atoms...
What are those?
Well, what they do is they control, with a kind of semiconductor, they're called a nanocrystal, the way electrons jump from level to level. We talk about a quantum leap. So it's like the Earth going around the sun, except the Earth could only go in distinct levels. And you can hit them with a bit of energy, get them to jump up to a higher energy orbit, and then when they jump down, they emit a particular light, like blue light, red light, or green light. So in contrast to your current LCD, which takes ordinary light and filters it, these create pure red light, pure green light, pure blue light, and will be available soon. The trouble was the original models of these were using cadmium, and that can be highly toxic to people. So it's interesting. The title of the patent I was just showing my class is called Cadmium-Free Quantum Dots, a sweeping patent, and I think rightly given over to Samsung. So you'll see it there. But it also has the potential, George, to use something like a quantum dot using light now, controlled light, as a switch, very much like we've used the electronic chip inside computer chips. So we need that. We need these other techniques. I mentioned extreme ultraviolet lithography. What's used right now, we take some tin, we zap it with a very powerful CO2 laser, and it creates a kind of plasma, an ionic gas. And from that, they harvest the extreme ultraviolet light. The machine that ASML make, and only they make it, costs about $250 million to $500 million. I mean, it's not something you can go down and buy at Walmart. And we're coming right up on the limit. So we have to cross over. We're going to use light. We'll get there somehow. But Moore's Law will keep marching on, I think, at least through 2030.
What does quantum computing mean, Bart?
In the simplest case, it's turning inputs to outputs by way of qubits. It's a little complicated, but a qubit is like a circuit, like an on-off switch, except instead of being either on and off, it's both. And so if I have 5 qubits, instead of being able to do 5 things on or off, I have 2 to the 5, or 32 possible outcomes. And you say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, let me give you this analogy, which I give in my class. Let's suppose we get the crazy idea that we want to put a distinct label on every particle in the universe, every subatomic particle, every quark, every lepton, virtual particles. And that's on the order of 10 to the 87 or 10 to the 90 particles. That's 1 with 90 zeros. But to play it safe, let's say we want a Google number of labels, and that would be 10 to the 100 power. 1 was followed by 100 zeros. It's a truly cosmologically large number. And my question to students is, if I give it a name, a unique string of zeros and ones, we call it a vector, how long does that string have to be? 1,000? 10,000? Answer, only 333. So 333 is such that if I take 2 to the 333, I have a Google. What does that mean? As soon as we have quantum computers, qubits, if we have 333 of them that work well, we can do effectively instantaneous code cracking, among many other things. And that means, and here we go, another unintended negative consequence. I mean, the main one of AI was deepfakes, then hallucinations. And now it looks like we're going to have a massive problem with privacy, because the scheme that we're using right now to secure this transmission, your banking account, and so much more is based on a form of encryption using prime numbers called public key encryption. And quantum computers, when they get just beyond that 333, can crack them very quickly. And there goes your privacy. Now, it's a panic of sorts, which is spurring a lot of great creativity in the quantum research world, and I do work in that. And the government agency NIST, one of my favorite government agencies, the National Institutes of Science and Technology, is about to roll out some protocols for quantum public key encryption, quantum key encryption, trying to address this. But we have the problem already of a lot of government actors and maybe private actors doing what is known as harvest now and decrypt later. So go ahead and store Georgia's private communications right now that we can't decrypt, knowing that as soon as quantum computers come online, we'll be able to decrypt them. And one last point on that, this is because of an ingenious algorithm from a Bell Labs researcher named Peter Shor. It's known as the Shor algorithm for factorization. It was a big deal when they got it to factor the number 15 into 3 times 5. But what we aren't ready for is large-scale implementation of the Shor algorithm in something known as the quantum Fourier transform, which is part of this package, and the effect that it'll have. It will spur creativity, but it's going to be at least as dangerous, I think, for a while as it has been with hallucinations and deepfakes.
Are we making chips here in the United States, or is everything being done in, like, Taiwan?
We are making chips here, George. One of the jokes about Silicon Valley, there's not much silicon in it anymore. It's mainly software engineering. So Arizona is emerging in some sense as the new Silicon Valley. And although I'm a big skeptic of government funding of technology, and especially picking winners, I think there were some good things in the CHIP Act that they passed last year, just because of the international tensions with China, the bottlenecks. I mean, the building apparently where the chips I mentioned that Apple are made has apparently more military ordnance aimed at it than any other building on the planet. I mean, it's that kind of a thing. A lot could go wrong. There's too many bottlenecks. There's all kinds of problems with supply chains of special elements higher up in the periodic table. So we have been moving that here. We're making more chips here. And the more important thing, I think, is that we don't just make the classical chips, that we prepare for this transition to light, that we now have emerging photo switches, photo-optical transistors in effect. And there'll be other things coming, too. And that's something we can definitely do in the United States and should.
How did you get involved in this, Bart?
You know, I've always had an interest in it, and as I stood my graduation line at high school, I was in a tiny town called Lansing, Kansas, with 4,000 people on the population side, but it's right next to Fort Leavenworth. And so we had a small physics class, and there was a former colonel teaching the Army colonel teaching my class, and I was in a private study with him in physics, and he handed me a book, literally as I'm going off to USC on a music composition scholarship of all things. And he hands me a book by Carl Sagan, who I got to know later, by the way. And the book was called The Dragons of Eden, Speculations on the Origins of Human Intelligence. It's what led to the Cosmos series, and he won the Pulitzer from it. And when I thought about that, George, and I'd never really thought about it before. I'd heard about computers, I was learning some mathematics, but it was Sagan's book. If there's one catalyst in my career that really kind of opened my mind to it, to what it would look like as there's surely intelligence evolving throughout the universe. Again, and you have 100 billion neurons in your head. You've got about that many stars in the Milky Way galaxy. You have at least 100 billion galaxies, if not a trillion galaxies in the world. Intelligence can form very quickly. We know it can form with plants to some degree, even with things like sponges that don't even have any neurons in them. So it has to be happening all over. And Sagan was way ahead in looking at that. And he's often, I think, derided for being a popularizer. He was actually a brilliant scientist, did some of the pioneering work on Venus and the really hard work, George, on how intelligence can originate on many kinds of planets and environments.
Fascinating. Bart, we're going to take a short break at the top of the hour. We're going to come back and take a final hour of phone calls with you next. The lines are now open with Dr. Bart Kosko, his latest re-released book, Fuzzy Thinking. Back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.